Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Glenn Houston Appleton Senior. I am the co-founder and CEO of AxumWe Marketplace. AxumWe Marketplace is a cultural commerce platform that is attempting to facilitate digital trade between and amongst African countries, driving the vision of the African Union as expressed through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA. AxumWe is also attempting to capture the diasporal African market operating in the United States and other parts of the world. A lot of trade take place between diasporal um, residents already, and so AxumWe is attempting to capture that, to centralize that. Last week we had a conversation around what AxumWe is and its significance in driving the AfCFTA. So today our emphasis is on AxumWe, its role in Africa, but with an emphasis on understanding ancient African history and how trade played a significant part in driving the civilizations that took place in Africa in ancient times, and why the AfCFTA will win. It will win, and AxumWe will play a significant role in winning in trade across Africa. Now, to understand trade in Africa is to understand the history of Africa and what trade has played in this history. For too long, pundits have analyzed the history of Africa as being associated with colonization or the slave trade, specifically the transatlantic slave trade, where more than 15 million of Africa's strong men were taken as slaves. And for close to 4 centuries, 400 years plus, Africa was exploited and its people became economic goods, sold and resold and resold and resold. And these people facilitated the economic boom of other regions of the world. And so the continent's history has been built around that. Another thing that drove the continent's history is the fact that though it did not have a seat on the table in the 1800s, we had this crumble for Africa when European powers decided to break the continent up and give a piece to each of themselves. Okay? But it is important that Africa has not been defined and cannot be defined around these two. Africa has a rich historical context in which we need to discuss the continent within its historical context. For more than 5,000 years, a lot of civilizations, at least 30 of them that we could map out, existed across the continent. At least 30 of them existed across the continent, and we will be attempting to look at them in this series. Now, in the West African belt, at least 10 powerful kingdoms existed in that region, and we will discuss in more detail, if we have time, what drove trade and commerce in that region and how powerful these kingdoms were. Okay, and then in the North African belt, at least 7 of the 30 powerful kingdoms existed. will also attempt to understand what drove trade in that region or drove power in that region. And in the East African belt, at least five powerful kingdoms arose. Kingdoms, civilizations arose. All right, and so was the Central African region. At least five powerful civilizations arose across Africa. And then in the Southern African belt, at least four powerful kingdoms arose. Now, between these time periods, there were other smaller kingdoms, civilizations that arose that we are not talking about today. But the ones that can be documented as significant kingdoms, at least 30 of these. And each of them had distinct cultures. They were kingdoms or empires with unique history and material significance. With unique historical and material significance throughout history. It's important that we understand that the continent did not just happen. The slave trade did not just, you know, label the continent as its origin. It is a fallacy to think that that defines Africa. Now, let's look at some of the time periods that these kingdoms lasted. Now, for context, it is important to note that historians would agree that it was nearly impossible for any nation at the time period without the United Nations and international laws as we have now. It was impossible for any nation to have lasted more than 100 years without being conquered. But these kingdoms lasted for significant time periods, and we should see an example of few of them. How significant uh, these kingdoms were. You have ancient Egypt, no quarrel about that. Even today, the architecture, the historical value, the significance of ancient Egypt is nothing to talk about. Historians agree that ancient Egypt played a significant role in historical architecture, medicine, science, agriculture, sculpture, language, arts. Many of these today still remain astonishing to modern science and engineering. Ancient Egypt. But then we also have the Kerman Empire or the Kush. And before we look at the Kerman Empire, the ancient Egypt lasted for nearly 3,000 years, at least 2,800 plus years, nearly 3,000 years. That's significant. That speaks of the might, the influence that it had. In fact, there was a time period when ancient Egypt was the world's superpower. The period in Bible history where the pharaohs ruled. Egypt was a world power. And then the Kerman Empire, okay, which lasted for 1700 years, 1700 years. That's a significant time period, 1700 years. And I'm hoping that this forms part of the discussion of each of these kingdoms that we will have later on, so that we could have an in-depth understanding of how these kingdoms thrive. And then you have the Kearney Bernu Empire that lasted nearly 1100 years, 1100 years. All right, the Kearney Bernu Empire. And then you have the Napatan Empire. The Napatan Empire lasted nearly 1200 years, nearly 1200 years. And that's significant. We're not talking about 10 years, we're talking about hundreds of years during those period when conquest was almost imminent. And then you had the Axiom Empire that lasted about 700 years. And we will talk about the Axiom Empire, from which AxumWe comes, the Axiom Empire and its influence in global trade. But we had the Ghana Empire, so powerful, so well known, almost like the Egyptian Empire, so well known, like the Malay Empire, the Songhai Empire, the Ghana Empire, well known for its gold trade. We will talk about that. The Malay Empire, obviously, with the richest man that ever walked the earth for centuries. All right, but then we had the great Zimbabwean Empire, which we will talk about. And each of these, the Ghana Empire lasted 600 years. The Axiom Empire lasted 700 years. The Malay Empire lasted 400 years, or 450 years almost. And then the Great Zimbabwean Empire lasted 350 years. So these are all significant things. Progress that happened in Africa around these civilizations. It is critical that we understand how civilizations across Africa thrived before the slave trade. That progress on the continent is not just limited to the slave trade. Now let's look at the comprehensive timeline of civilizations across the different regions of Africa. Now, we had the Kerman Empire, which existed between 3200 BCE to 1480 BCE. And you had the ancient Egypt, which existed between 3100 BCE to 332 BCE. And you have the um, Garametes Empire that lasted between 1000 BCE to 7 BCE. That's a long period. You have the Carthage Empire between the 9th century BCE to 146 BCE. And you have the Napatan Empire between the 8th century BCE to the 4th century BCE. And you have the Mauritanian Empire between the 4th century BCE to the 40, uh, 4400 CE. And you had the New Media Empire between 202 BCE to 46 BCE. And that's just the North African belt. And you have the East African belt. You have the Land of Punt between 2500 BCE to 2100 BCE. You have the Damat Empire between 980 BCE to 400 BCE. You have the Axiom Empire between the 1st century, okay, to the 8th century CE. And you have the Swahili city states between the 9th to the 16th century. And then you have the Somali Sultanates between the 10th century to the 17th century. That's East Africa. Let's look at West Africa. Now, this is just to give you perspective of how civilizations existed across the African continent, that the history of Africa does not begin with the slave trade. There were other trades that took place around the continent. So it is important that we know that. And why are we talking about the significance of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or area and the role that AxumWe plays in facilitating trade? But it is important that trade in Africa is historical. In West Africa, you have the Nuke culture or the Nuke Empire between 500 BCE to 200 CE. You have the Ghana Empire between the 7th century to the 13th century. You have the Igbo Empire between the 9th century to 15th century. You have the Kernu Empire between the 9th and the 19th century. You have the Hausa city states between the 10th century to the 19th century, you have the Yoruba, the Afi. Between the 11th and the 15th century, you have the Mali Empire between 1235 um, to the 17th century. And you have the Benin Kingdom between the 13th to the 19th century. You have the Yoruba or the Oyo Empire or Kingdom between the 14th and the 19th century. You have Songhay Empire between the 15th and the 16th century. These are all powerful civilizations that took place or that existed, that arose across the African continent. And you have the Central African region. You have the Sao civilization between the 5th century BC and the 16th century. You have the Congo Kingdom between the 14th and the 19th century. You have the Luba Kingdom between the 14th and the 19th century. You have the Kuba Kingdom between 1625 to the 19th century. You have the Londa Kingdom between the 17th and the 19th centuries. Then the Southern Africa belt, you have the Ompongua, Ompongua Empire. I'm sorry, guys. It's just a bit tough for me, but it's critical. And that existed between the 11th to the 13th centuries. And you have the Great Zimbabwe or the Great Zimbabwe Empire between the 11th and the 15th centuries. And you have the Mupata Kingdom between 1450 to early 20th century. You have the Kami Empire between 1450 to 1683 CE, respectively. So these are just 30 of the civilizations that took place across Africa. The rise of Africa is not now. The rise of Africa, the history of Africa is not limited to the transatlantic slave trade. The rise of Africa dates back more than 5,000 years. Now let's look at the engine of prosperity in these kingdoms. What drove growth and prosperity within these kingdoms? It's important. Why the inter-Africa trade is so significant, and the drive of the AfCFTA will see significant progress on the continent because trade has always played a significant part of prosperity on the African continent. Now, a central valuable resource and routes. Central valuable resources and trade routes were significant in defining trade in ancient Africa. There was either that a nation state or a kingdom was a major trade route that facilitated trade between and amongst other sub-regions because of its suitable positioning, or it traded in something of value. Okay, so it is important to understand that wealth at the time was built around those two, even though there were other economic factors that drove um, trade and significance in those days, but the root was important, and the resource of trade was also important. Empires rose and fell based on their ability to manage vast networks. As empires existed and expanded in ancient Africa, they rose and became mightier. But when they were not able to keep these networks, keep these sub-regions under their control, they broke off. Then conquest took place because they were not able to do so. So let's look at the trans-Saharan routes in terms of routes. Okay, so the masters of trade were mostly defined around the routes of trade. You had the West Africa and the North African belt of trade, and what took place between that region or that route was mostly gold, salt, and slaves. All right, so the slave trade before the transatlantic slave trade existed somehow, though at a lower level. But slave, the selling of slave existed in almost every part of human history. At one point in time, at least one of the human race was a slave. Okay, so you had gold sought and slave that took place along that trade route. And you have the Indian Ocean Network or trade route, which was was between East Africa or Zimbabwe and Arabia, Persia, and India. So the goods that traveled that route was gold, ivory, and iron. So gold, ivory, and iron. So the major trade route facilitated the movement of gold, ivory, and iron. So the movement of goods and services was an important part of African trade. And then you have the Nile and Red Sea trade route, which saw trade between the Axiom Kingdom and Egypt and the Roman world or the ancient Roman Empire. And that moved that route was gold, ivory, and incense. So a critical uh, um, element of trade was also the route, but the good being traded. Now let's look at the trade commodities. We've looked at the trade routes. So those routes facilitated trade, but the commodities also that drove trade within these regions. Okay. Now the most significant of them was gold. Throughout African history, gold has played a significant part of trade on the continent, and gold was one of its most valuable um, commodity that it traded on the global market. Okay, we know about Mali, the richest man that ever lived for centuries. Mensa Musa was so rich that when he went to Mecca, he gave out so much gold that the value of gold fell, and that's a known history. Okay, and he was an African. So trade has been a significant part. That is why it is important that Africa comes back to its roots, the roots of trade. We know the Ghana Empire as well was known as the Gold Coast. So gold was a significant commodity within the Ghana Empire as well. And then another important commodity of trade within ancient Africa was salt. Salt was so important that it was processed along the sea coast, brought inland, but it was also exported. Okay, as we saw, salt was moved between West Africa and North Africa, between that belt. Salt was a major commodity. And then we had ivory. All right, ivory historically has always been a treasured product. So ivory moved between uh, two trade routes between the Indian Ocean network, okay, which included East Africa, Zimbabwe, and Arabia, Persia, and India. So that route you had ivory that moved through, and then below that also you had the Nile and Red Sea trade between the Kush Axiom Empire and Egypt and the Roman world. And ivory also played a significant role in that economic route. And then you have slaves. Obviously, slaves were sold and resold. So slave played an important part as well. And we saw slaves, especially between the West African and North African belt, but it also extended beyond those regions. Copper was also an important, and it was impossible to mine copper without technology. So we will talk about the technology that facilitated these economic booms during these periods. But copper was also a major commodity of trade during ancient African times. But then you also had textiles. fabrics like the one I am wearing today that AxumWe is trying to promote as a traditional good across Africa and its diaspora. Okay, so textiles was also an important um, um, trading commodity. Now let's focus on the technology that drove trade in ancient Africa. They were importing technological instruments or discoveries that drove trade within ancient Africa, and four of the most important ones, including iron. Now, iron throughout all of human history has been a major technology that shifted different time periods and facilitated the speed, what I would call the temporal sovereignty, which is something we would talk about later on. But the temporal sovereignty, the ability of a nation to take advantage of the revolution of change, benefit from it before the next one comes. So iron played a significant role in shaping trade and advancements in ancient Africa. In fact, there were advanced methods of smelting irons in the Empire and also the Kuba Kingdom. But hydraulic engineering, okay, that facilitated irrigation in the Sahara River region, the Sahara region, and the Algerian rivers region. But it's also important that that also played a significant role in ancient Egypt, moving water from the Nile River to other parts of Egypt that played, that gave it its superpower in agriculture. So it is important that hydraulic engineering in those days existed. So in it existed where? In Africa. Okay, these existed where? In Africa. So it is important. But you also had architecture, all right? Like we have the pyramids of Egypt and Kush, okay? And then even the Axiom Empire, all right? And the great Zimbabwe, the architecture of these kingdoms remain a marvel till today, especially ancient Egypt, but also the Axiom Kingdom. But more profound was the fact that a few of these kingdoms had their own currencies. All right, you have the Axiom Kingdom that smelted its own gold and produced its own gold coins, and it traded in its own money. It had exchange rates. All right, it negotiated trade in its own money, and that's significant. That shows great power. All right, but you had the Kelwa kingdom as well that melted its own currency, signaling advanced economies. These signaled advanced economies. So, ancient Africa, the history of ancient Africa is not just about the slave trade, but there were also complex governance systems in ancient Africa that showed the complexities of this period, of this time frame, of their systems, all right, their procedures, their system of governance, of administration, of rule, of law, all right. And you had the sacred kingship. The sacred kingship was a system of governance that saw monarchs on the throne, and those kinds of leadership was not just about a nuclear family, but the kinship could be passed down to brothers. All right, so the leadership could also be passed down to brothers, and that family, the entire family, was sacred. And then you have the military-led expansion throughout all of human history. Military conquest played a significant role in the rise and fall of kingdoms, of civilizations. Even in today's world, you still have military might playing significant roles determining the might, I mean, the strength of nations. But then you have centralized administration, especially in Egypt. All right, you had centralized administration. All right, you had governors, but those governors reported to a central government. So there was a kind of mix. It was not a complete federal system, but you had the regional governors reporting something like what happened in ancient Roman Empire, but you had the theocratic rule. Obviously, there were periods in almost all of human history when deities ruled the world. So that also happened in ancient Africa. Now let's look at a few spotlights in the African civilizations. A few spotlights. It's important to understand these spotlights because to talk about the rise of Africa, to talk about why trade is playing a significant role in today's Africa rise, is to understand the fundamental role that trade played in ancient Africa. Let's look at a few of them. The Ghana Empire, known for its gold trade, okay, was massive. A period of influence. It had a huge influence in that period because of gold. But we also know that it had a huge influence because of the transatlantic slave trade when it was a major shipping route of slaves as well. But gold played a significant period in that, and then it was a lucrative gold and salt trade route. But ancient Malay also was a lucrative gold route. All right, and the Songhay Empire also a lucrative gold route. So gold played a significant role in all of these three empires in these three time periods. And then the great Zimbabwean empire had more than 10,000 inhabitants, and in those days that was powerful, and its capital was gold rich. All right, and massive stone enclosures housed a population of over 10,000. So it had a great wall, like you have the Great Wall of China today. So it is important to understand the history of Africa in relation to trade. Okay, now let's look at the Axiom Empire. Now, if you would recount AxumWe as a platform, takes its name from the Axiom Empire. All right, a great kingdom that existed at the time in Africa that facilitated global trade. All right, so Axiom, but it also facilitated inter-African trade. So from the first century to the 8th century, Axiom was a major power linking the Roman world with India. Its wealth was built along the Red Sea and the Nile River trade, and it was so great it minted its own gold coins. It had its own gold. It's significant to understand that for a nation in that time period to have the intelligence to build its own economy on the financial system, it meant sophistication. It adopted Christianity in the 4th century, so it had a blend of traditional African practices and Christian civilization, leaving behind the giant stela as monuments to its power. It's important that we understand these, and this this position it in the ancient world. In fact, it moved trade in ancient Rome. Just imagine in ancient Rome and in India at the time from East Africa, and it controlled the Red Sea ports. It moved trade in the Roman world, India, but also to Arabia and down to the Nubian or the Kush Empire during those periods. So it covered that entire um, circumference, that entire area. So you see how mighty the Axiom kingdom was. Now, so we will look at 10 influential kingdoms during the historic periods of the rise of kingdoms and civilizations across Africa. And we've talked about ancient Egypt, but they were referred to and even today referred to as the monument builders of the world. The monument builders of the world. They were unified around 3100 BCE, and it was the world's fundamental civilization. All right, the world's fundamental civilization. That's how it's described, and famous for its pyramids uh, and its own style of writing and its own style of leadership. The pharaohs were divine leaders at the time, so its wealth was built on the Nile's agriculture, creating a culture that lasted millennia. The Nile River, creating a culture that lasted thousands of years, as we saw ancient Egypt for nearly 30,000 years. Ancient Egypt existed for nearly 30,000 years, 27,700, nearly 28,000 years going to 30,000 years. But then you had the Kush kingdom. They were known as the Iron Pharaohs of Nubia, and these were so powerful people that at one point in time they attacked and conquered ancient Egypt. And the 25th dynasty of the Egyptian leadership were actual Kush people. Okay, they were Kush people because they conquered ancient Egypt at the time. The Axiom Empire, known as the Red Sea powerhouse, as we saw, they controlled the entire Red Sea belt from the sea port of Kush up to the Roman Empire to India to Arabia, that entire belt, they circumferenced that belt. So it's important to understand that trade across Africa has been a significant part of his history. And then you have the Ghana Empire, the land of gold. All right, as we've talked about it already, you have the Malay Empire, the home of the richest man, as we've talked about already. That when he went to Mecca, the price of gold became like sand. And then you had the Songhai Empire, also referred to as the West African superpower at the time. And these were all powerful kingdoms. You have the great Zimbabwean Empire that we've talked about. You have the Swahili city states, a number of smaller states along the Indian Ocean that facilitated maritime time during that period. You have the Benin Empire, referred to as the Bronze Masters. Their bronze was so powerful and pricey during that period. And you had the Congo Kingdom. They were the Christian kingdom of Central Africa. They embraced Christianity at an earlier stage, and they had a semblance of culture that was a blend, just like the Axiom kingdom. So, guys, we will stop here for today. But the central message is that Africa's history is not limited or does not begin from the transatlantic slave trade. It dates back at least 5,000 years or more. Now, for the Egypt, even though there are those who argue that Egypt is not historically part of Africa, and we cannot say that is a representation of the African history, Egypt is a part of Africa. And Egypt is, in fact, a representation of ancient African history that lasted close to 30,000 years. So we just say 5,000 for most of the other kingdoms, but for more than 28,000 years, the Egyptian empire existed. Okay, so guys, it's important that we contextualize the inter-Africa trade that is facilitated by the AfCFTA and that is driven by AxumWe. It is not something that is new to Africa. Africa has been the home of trade, and Africa will thrive on trade. I see you until we meet again next week to discuss yet an important aspect of African trade. Thank you.